And now? He had learned the hard way, that assumption was wrong. His wife opened her mouth to say something. I raised a finger gently. Let's not make this messy, I said softly. Everything is legal. Everything is above board. And I suggest we act like adults moving forward. The irony was delicious. The very people who had thought they were managing me were now the ones scrambling. I was the calm in their storm, the one they had underestimated all along. And as I watched them fumble, I realized something else, something far more important than victory or revenge. Respect isn't demanded. It's quietly commanded. And when people finally see you for who you really are, they remember it forever. For the first time in decades, they saw me, not just as the mother, the grandmother, the caretaker, but as a woman who had lived fully, thought carefully, and acted decisively. They thought I was small. They thought I would bend. The truth? I was unstoppable all along. After the initial shock faded, I found myself sitting quietly in the living room, sipping the same coffee I had that morning. The house was technically theirs, but in truth, nothing felt the same. Not for them. Not for me. I reflected on life, the years spent raising a child, managing a home, balancing sacrifices with patience. All of it had led to this moment. Not a moment of anger. Not a moment of revenge. But a moment of clarity. I thought about the countless times I had bent to accommodate others. The times I had swallowed frustration to keep peace. The nights I had stayed awake worrying while everyone else slept comfortably. And I realized something, none of that weakness had defined me. None of that bending had broken me. It had strengthened me. Because strength is quiet. Strength is measured. Strength is the ability to act decisively when the world assumes you won't. I glanced at my son. He was still pacing, still trying to process, still fumbling with the truth he refused to accept. But inside, my mind was buzzing, not with anger or revenge, but with plans and clarity. For years, I had been the caretaker. The mother. The grandmother. The woman everyone assumed would silently bend, smile, and absorb life's chaos without complaint. But the events of the past weeks had taught me a vital lesson: life doesn't respect assumptions, it respects action. Quiet, deliberate action. I laid out breakfast that morning with care. Toast. Eggs. Coffee. Fresh fruit. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. But every item had been intentionally chosen. Not for show, not for applause, but to assert calm order. When my son walked into the kitchen, he paused. The way he looked at me had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a yelling, confrontational way. But subtly, an almost imperceptible shift that spoke louder than words. For the first time in a long time, he was measuring me, instead of assuming me. Morning, he said, tentative, cautious, trying to keep his voice casual. I smiled gently, keeping eye contact. Morning, I replied, calm, composed, unshakable. That's when I realized, the new rules weren't going to be announced. They wouldn't be negotiated. They would be lived. Every action I took, every word I spoke, every small movement of my day would quietly assert boundaries that no one could ignore. I started small. Breakfast was eaten on my schedule. Conversations about chores or household decisions were no longer hijacked by him or his wife. I listened first, responded when necessary, and set limits with words so soft, they felt like whispers, but carried the weight of steel. I reminded myself that power isn't always loud. Power doesn't have to slam doors or shout. Real power is subtle. It is patient. It is consistent. And when people underestimate it, they pay the price, not immediately, but eventually. My daughter-in-law, who had always seemed composed, tried to slip into her usual routine, hoping to maintain control. But she noticed, slowly, that I wasn't reacting as I once would have. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I didn't beg for acknowledgement. I just acted within the rules of my own life, and those rules were unshakable. Even my son, who had thought he could push me around, began testing boundaries quietly, only to be reminded that my calm was not compliance. My patience was not weakness. And my silence was not passivity. I spent that entire morning moving through my home with purpose. Organizing. Tidying. Smiling at grandchildren. Answering small questions. Making casual conversation. Every interaction carefully measured, every response deliberate, every action reinforcing the reality. I was in charge of my life now, and nothing would change that. By the afternoon, the new rhythm had already begun to form. He would no longer automatically assume he could make decisions for me. She would no longer automatically disregard my input. And I would no longer automatically defer to anyone. This was the first day of a new chapter. A chapter where respect was earned, boundaries were enforced, and empowerment was lived quietly, but unmistakably. I leaned against the counter and watched them navigate this shift. The subtle tension. The small hesitations. The moments where they realized, perhaps for the first time, that I was no longer someone to be managed or dismissed. I let them figure it out, letting the truth speak louder than any argument ever could. Because here's the truth. Life rewards calm decisiveness, not chaos. It respects strategy, not volume. And it notices women who have lived fully, thought clearly, and acted quietly, but effectively, to protect themselves and their values. And in that realization, I felt a satisfaction far richer than any confrontation could provide, a deep, grounded contentment, knowing that the rules had changed, and this time, they were my rules. They thought the household ran on assumptions. They were about to learn it ran on respect. My respect, and it wasn't up for negotiation. The afternoon stretched on like any other, but it wasn't ordinary. The house felt different. Not empty, not chaotic, but balanced, as if the air itself had recognized the shift in dynamics. Every step I took, every action, carried weight. Not in a way that screamed control, but in a way that subtly reminded everyone who had forgotten. I began my day with ordinary tasks. Organizing the living room, straightening cushions, checking the mail, folding laundry. But even in these mundane acts, there was a statement. Every motion was deliberate. Every word I spoke carried authority, not arrogance, not aggression, just the calm assurance of someone fully aware of their own power. My son attempted to assert control, as he always did. Not in a loud or confrontational way. He had learned that yelling accomplished nothing, but in subtle ways. Trying to decide the schedule for household chores. Offering suggestions as if they were directives. Testing my reactions. I met him with questions. Not to argue. Not to challenge unnecessarily. Simply to force reflection. Did we agree on that schedule? I would ask, tilting my head thoughtfully, sipping my coffee. Oh, well, I thought, he would start, only to pause when he realized I wasn't reacting emotionally. I let him pause. I let the weight of the question sink in. Silence is powerful. People underestimate the impact of being heard but not obeyed. Sometimes I would redirect conversations gently. Why don't you tell me your plan, and I'll share mine afterward. Simple. Polite. Firm. Yet every interaction reminded him, and she, that I was no longer simply background support. Even my daughter-in-law, who had seemed confident and composed before, began to notice the shift. She no longer assumed her perspective would dominate. She observed my calm authority and slowly understood. This household no longer ran on assumptions or entitlement. It ran on respect earned in quiet but unmistakable way. The grandchildren, too, absorbed these subtle lessons. They saw how I carried myself, how I responded calmly but decisively. How I didn't need to shout to be heard. How patience, consistency, and clarity were often more powerful than volume. By late afternoon, a rhythm had formed. Decisions were made with me, not around me. Conversations flowed naturally, without struggle for dominance. I had established the new rules, not by confrontation, but through everyday actions. And in the stillness of that evening, as the sun poured through the windows and the house felt alive yet calm, I realized something profound. Empowerment isn't loud. It isn't aggressive. It's practiced daily, in subtle actions, in deliberate words, in the quiet assertion of boundaries. I smiled to myself, knowing that the lessons of patience, observation, and quiet decisiveness were not only being recognized, they were absorbed. Not just by my family, but by me. Because here's the truth that every woman who has been underestimated eventually learns. Power doesn't need shouting. Respect doesn't need fear. Control doesn't need chaos. All it needs is clarity, consistency, and confidence in yourself. They may have thought they were teaching me lessons, but in truth, I was teaching them, and the quietest lessons hit the hardest. By the late afternoon, the house had settled into a rhythm that was entirely new. Not chaotic. Not loud. But different. As if every corner, every beam, every shadow sensed a shift in authority. The balance had changed, subtly, irrevocably. And the ones who had underestimated me were learning, slowly but surely, that quiet strength often carries the greatest weight. I moved through the rooms with calm purpose, doing ordinary things, watering plants, dusting shelves, checking on laundry. But even in these simple actions, there was a message. Every step, every motion, conveyed that I was no longer invisible, no longer just the mother, the grandmother, the woman everyone had assumed would quietly accommodate life on their terms. I noticed my son watching me from the kitchen doorway. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a quiet tension. The kind that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone for years. He had assumed compliance, patience, and silence meant weakness. He had assumed I would bend, like I had for decades. But the calmness, the deliberate nature of my actions, and the small, consistent reminders of my authority had spoken louder than any argument ever could. Even my daughter-in-law, who had always seemed confident and poised, had begun to adjust her own behavior. She now spoke more thoughtfully, asked questions before making assumptions, and, most importantly, observed my actions carefully. She understood, finally, that respect wasn't optional. It wasn't something you demand or manipulate. It was something you earned. The grandchildren noticed too. They watched silently as I handled the household, as I moved through the home with calm decisiveness. They absorbed lessons without me uttering a single harsh word. Patience is a form of power. Silence can carry authority. Boundaries, when enforced consistently and gently, shape the way people interact with you. I realized then that the impact of quiet empowerment wasn't limited to the house. It extended outward, into the neighborhood, into family dynamics, into relationships that had always assumed my compliance. Neighbors, friends, even distant relatives began treating me differently. Not with fear, but with recognition. Recognition of a woman who had lived, observed, and acted with wisdom that could not be dismissed. As the evening sun filtered through the windows, casting golden streaks across the floors, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about all the times I had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. I thought about the countless women who silently manage households, careers, families, and expectations, yet are assumed to be passive. And I understood, our quiet strength is often invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable. By living decisively, by acting consistently, by asserting boundaries in subtle yet firm ways, I had changed the course of my household and, in a way, taught life lessons that would last longer than any verbal lecture. The ripple effect was clear. What started with one deliberate action, setting boundaries, claiming my space, asserting my presence, spread throughout the home. It shaped behaviors, shifted assumptions, and established respect that would endure far beyond that day. And in that reflection, I felt a deep satisfaction. Not triumph. Not vengeance. But clarity. Empowerment. A sense that I had finally created the life I deserved, without drama, without shouting, but with deliberate intention. Sometimes the loudest lessons are whispered, not shouted, and the ones who underestimate quiet strength always learn the hardest way. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight was spilling through the windows in that way that makes everything feel golden and ordinary, completely unaware of the storm brewing in a few heartbeats. He came home like any other day. No warnings. No calls. Just the casual assumption that everything was normal. The first step he took across the threshold revealed the truth that had been quietly reshaping his world. Things were no longer as he thought they were. I was in the kitchen, quietly sipping my tea, humming a soft tune I had been thinking about all morning. My demeanor? Calm. Unshaken. Ordinary. Nothing in my actions betrayed the quiet storm of decisions that had taken place over the past weeks. He froze. His hand hovered over the doorknob, then lowered slowly as confusion flickered across his face. It wasn't anger yet. Not fully. It was that rare, unsettling emotion you feel when reality suddenly disagrees with everything you've assumed. Morning, I said, politely, casually, almost as if we were having the same day we always had. Hi. He stammered. The words barely made it out. His eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for clues. Then they landed on me, and the subtle truth began to sink in. The house he thought he controlled was no longer in his hands. I set my tea down slowly, deliberately, and looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes. Yes, I said. Everything is in order. The house has been sold. He blinked. Then blinked again. Wait, what? He whispered, as if saying it louder would somehow undo it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step forward. I didn't show glee. I simply allowed the words to sit in the room like a tangible weight, pressing against the invisible assumptions he had carried for decades. His wife, usually so confident, now hesitated in the doorway, sensing the shift but unsure how to respond. She had assumed, like him, that I would quietly comply, smile, and step aside. But the calm I carried, the deliberate, measured way I navigated this moment, was a force neither of them had expected. He tried to regain composure, pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, attempting to reclaim control, but the reality was inescapable. The quiet decision had already reshaped their world. I walked past him, toward the window, letting the sunlight warm my back, and said softly, I acted when it mattered. Quietly, efficiently, and legally. Sometimes that's more powerful than yelling or fighting. The moment he stepped inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. The air itself was heavy with anticipation, though nothing in the room had changed. The sunlight spilled lazily across the floors, the aroma of coffee lingered in the air, and the usual sounds, the ticking clock, distant birds, kept going as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. He froze mid-step, his bag slung awkwardly over one shoulder. His eyes flicked from the kitchen counter to the doorway, then to me. There was confusion, disbelief, and the faintest trace of fear, an emotion he hadn't expected to feel toward me. I looked up from my cup of tea. Calm. Composed. Smiling softly. Almost like we were having a perfectly ordinary morning. Hey, I said, in that gentle tone I had mastered over decades, the tone that carried authority without needing volume. Hey, he mumbled, uncertain, trying to mask the tension. But it was useless. His facade was cracking already. He hadn't yet realized the full weight of what had happened. The papers, the legal transfers, the ownership. All of it had been done quietly, without confrontation, without a single hint of drama. And now, in the silence of our living room, he was forced to confront reality. You sold the house?" he finally asked, voice shaky, as if saying it louder would somehow make it untrue. "Yes," I replied evenly, taking a deliberate sip of tea. "And it's done." He stumbled backward slightly, almost instinctively reaching for the counter to steady himself. His jaw tightened, hands trembling. Not with rage. Not yet. With a sudden, dawning understanding that he had misjudged me entirely. For years, he had assumed that my patience was weakness. That my quiet compliance was agreement. That my silence meant acceptance. But now, in this single moment, the truth hit him like a wave. Silence can be strategy, patience can be power, and calm decisiveness can dismantle assumptions faster than any argument. He tried to speak again, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "But, you can't just." I raised a hand, not to scold, not to intimidate, but to halt the chaos he expected. My tone was soft, deliberate, unwavering. "Watch me." The words were simple. No drama. No emotion-laden accusations. Yet they carried the full weight of authority. Every pause, every carefully measured word reminded him that the power in this room no longer rested with him. He looked around the kitchen, as if hoping the walls would offer him a clue, some invisible loophole that would undo what had been done. I sat at the table and opened my notebook. For years, it had been a place for grocery lists, reminders, other people's needs. That morning, I turned to a blank page and wrote one sentence. What do I want now? The question scared me. Not because I didn't have answers, but because I had ignored them for so long. I wanted peace. I wanted respect. I wanted a life where my